Welcome, everybody. This is Sanjeev, Joshipura, Executive Director of Indiaspora. And I'm joined on this phone call by Mansi Patel, our Senior Communications Manager, and of course, our founder, M.R. Rangaswamy, who's also Chairman of our board. We are delighted today to welcome global intellectual and prominent Indian diaspora, Parag Khanna. Parag Khanna is the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. He is an international best-selling author of 6 books, who has traveled to almost every country in the world that you can think of, and some that I definitely cannot even name. And he holds a PhD from the London School of Economics, among his various other degrees. This is just a very short bio of Parag. If I were to launch into his longer bio, it would take the entire phone call to list out his accomplishments. So we'll let our listeners Google you a little bit, Parag. But welcome to the call.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for being here. And you're on the line today from Singapore, where you're based. Is that correct?
I'm in London, actually, kicking off.
You're in London today. Wow. Yeah, talk about a global traveler.
There you go.
Awesome. Well, Parag, so I wanted to start by talking about, I just mentioned that you as an Indian diaspora, you've lived in many, many different countries. You've worked in even more. But really, tell us a little bit about a couple of things. First of all, tell us about your childhood and your journey and, how you got to being the person you are today. Who is Parag and what makes him tick? And then I also want you to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences as an Indian diaspora, person of Indian origin, living in all these different countries, what you really found as sort of the main highlights and takeaways from each of those places.
That's a great question. It's really two sides of the same coin in the sense that, having been born in India, I've been a global Indian since birth because we lived in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, then in New York. Then I also lived in Germany during high school. I studied in the US and the UK, and I've been returning to a number of these countries kind of over and over, especially a place like Germany, where I went to high school, then a part of university, and even as recently as last year, my whole family moved to Germany for a sabbatical that I was on. So there's a number of places that I call home, and I definitely have appreciated, not just recently, but really for a long time, as someone who's actually studied diasporas academically and written about diasporas, the fact that one of the peculiar advantages of being a member of the Indian diaspora is our adaptability, right? Our ability to immerse and to assimilate in different societies, especially given English language and so forth. So I've been very cognizant of that really throughout. And now what's interesting is that having grown up as what we called in America an Asian American, I now find myself being what I have termed an American Asian. Someone who's returned to Asia after decades and is reintegrating into Asian society, in this case, Singapore, and, rediscovering the Asia that was left behind. And as growing up, whether it was in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, there was just a more or less assumption that once you leave Asia to migrate to the more developed West, you wouldn't really ever return. And my parents sometimes still struggle with this notion that we decided to, leave New York, leave London, and go back to Asia. And of course, in many ways, it was the best decision we ever made because Asia is experienced such unbelievable growth and development and modernization and confidence that it has today. That's part of the reason why I wrote this entire book about it, is to really capture that Asian moment. And also, in the intervening years, having kind of become a political scientist, international relations theorist, academic, and working in government and traveling around the world, I came to realize that there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge about Asia. We tend to, for one thing, to hold Asia to be synonymous with China, and that's not accurate or healthy in terms of our understanding. Of course, it neglects India, for one thing, which is quite obvious to us, but very often overlooked by others. And it tends to make the view, or leads to the view that Asia is kind of an Eastern authoritarian threat. But one of the things I point out in this book is that there are more people living in democracies in Asia, such as India, than in the entire rest of the world put together. And as you know, India is having an election in the next 6 months, so is Indonesia, the Philippines. So, I try to take my travels as an Indian, as a global Indian, as an academic, and weave together these stories that try to paint a more kind of sophisticated and complex understanding of where the world is going.
Parag, I'm glad you mentioned your upcoming book, your sixth book, The Futurization. I do want to talk about that, but before we get to that, just very quickly, I've been following your career, and I've been very impressed by the breadth of what it is that you do. I noticed that you were recently at Davos, for example, speaking with the global managing director of McKinsey. I know you've advised in partnership with your wife, various governments, and you run this strategic advisory firm. So there's a lot of different impressive things that you do. But speaking of Davos, because I think it's quite timely, given that it's just concluded, if you could just walk our listeners through quickly what you thought the mood was. I mean, at this event, was it more downcast than usual? Was it more circumspect? What was the sense of the event that you got?
It's a great question. It was definitely a pessimistic mood, not only because of the headline data that we will definitely have slowing growth economically. There was also, of course, the ongoing trade war and the populism and the uncertainty about Brexit and so forth. But, and this is one of the things that I spoke about at length with Kevin Sneader, the global managing partner of McKinsey, is that, he lives in Hong Kong. He's the first McKinsey executive to be running the company from Asia, because traditionally, of course, that's been done out of London and New York. And so what he and I were lamenting is that in the region that we live in and that we know very well, the mood is almost the exact opposite of what you were hearing inside the corridors at Davos. And that's really a pity. So the fact is, it's an organization that's meant to convene global leaders from all walks of life, all stakeholders, to have a global conversation. But it really did feel like two separate conversations. There was a Western conversation and an Asian conversation. And it is the former that really dominated the agenda, unfortunately.
That's really interesting, because I think that's a great segue into talking about your new book, which I think is just about to come out now in the next month or so, I believe. Is that correct? Futurization, Parag?
It will be out on February the 5th, so very, very soon.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we are looking forward to this. Will be your sixth book, is that right?
That's right.
Wonderful, awesome. So tell us a little bit about the premise of your book, Futurization, and specifically what I would like you to delve into a little bit is we have often heard this, comparison here in the West, at least, and I'm sure you've heard it too in your various travels and so forth. Talk about China, talk about India. When will India get to where China is? The differences in both the political and economic stages of development of both countries, their geopolitical role vis-a-vis the U.S. and so forth. So dive, if you would, Parag, a little bit into that in the context of your book, The Futurization.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned before, Asia is a region of 5 billion people. China is only 1.4 billion of those people. Its population is aging, its growth is decelerating. Meanwhile, India has now become the world's fastest growing large economy. ASEAN, of the region of Southeast Asia, has a larger GDP than India does, by the way, and receives more foreign investment than China. So Asia is, in fact, truly multipolar. In most of Asia's history, it's been multipolar. So this is a very intensely geopolitical book, because in geopolitics and in the mainstream conversations and debates of geopolitics, we're always talking about who's number one. If it's not America, is it going to be China? And my argument is that the world is actually multipolar. The United States and North America are a superpower. Europe is still a superpower. And Asia has multiple great powers, including China, but also India, also Japan, Australia. I count Russia as an Asian power, and so forth. And if you look at Asian history, none of this should be particularly difficult to understand, because Asian history is the history of multipolar landscape of many great civilizations, none of which really has the capability to dominate the others, and if they do, not for very long. And so when we use these artificial Western models to talk about the future of Asia, we wind up making very gigantic errors. And those errors intellectually lead to errors politically. Because if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is really China's signature venture, it gives the impression to most scholars, in the United States or elsewhere, that it's a one-way ticket to China's dominance of the world. But that's actually not the way it's likely to play out. And in the book, I make the case country by country, looking at everywhere from Indonesia to India to Kazakhstan and so forth, that in fact countries are going to use the modernization and the infrastructure that they're getting from China to grow rapidly and to attract more foreign investment and to dilute China's influence in their country, not to enhance it. So in a way, Belt and Road will have the opposite impact of what most people think. And the argument I'm making is actually very consistent with imperial history more broadly. You can almost say this about every empire in history, especially the British, that by giving their colonies the tools, in the case of India, railways, civil service, administrative service, English, you give your colonies the power and the confidence to resist you. And China is doing exactly the same thing. So that's the geopolitical arguments are a very significant part of the book. And there's a lot more about how the economies are evolving, how they reinforce each other's growth rather than competing with each other, about how Asian countries are leapfrogging technologically, whether it's mobile healthcare or digital finance and so forth. And a lot about culture, quite frankly, because the Asianization of the world, as I call it, which is really the great cultural trend of the 21st century, has some concrete metrics around it. You can see the ways in which countries are starting to learn from Asian systems, our technocratic governments in Asia, the farsightedness of policy, the emphasis on infrastructure and education. These are very tangible things. And how come it is that when we talk about soft power, quote unquote, we're only ever talking about, Premier League football or Hollywood, right? Why don't we ever talk about Asian soft power? So what I do in the book is actually try to measure it and quantify it. And I'll tell you this, it's a lot more than just the number of people who are studying Chinese, right? There's a lot more to it, and it emanates from many countries, including most certainly India as well.
Parag, I find your premise quite fascinating. There is another prominent global thinker and intellectual of Indian origin who I follow quite closely. His name is Farid Zakaria. I'm sure you've heard of him. And he has talked about something fairly similar in the past. I'd love at Indiaspora to be able to get you and Farid on the same stage together to talk about your perspectives on this subject.
Oh yeah, we have shared the stage together several times. I've been on his show several times. He's a great friend and mentor. We play tennis together actually sometimes, he's been a great role model and supporter for a long time. And we agree, I guess you could say, on many things, if not most things. I think it's almost uncanny actually. He's obviously some years older than me, but our experiences have tracked in a number of institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations. And, I've learned a great deal from him. I've approached a lot of the global issues differently just because of how I grew up and all the places that I've traveled to. So, I try to be, and still try to be, even as I get older, very, very boots on the ground. It's my way of, it's just my lifestyle choice is very different. But, we approach the issues in our research in different ways, but we've come to very similar conclusions. And I'm, always very grateful when my opinions align with his.
Parag, when I wore a younger man's clothes, I used to be a ranked tennis player in Mumbai schools. So wow. I look forward to maybe getting across the net from you and Farid and, sharing a hit at some point. We'll see who wins. But let me bring in my colleague at this point, Mansi, because I know before the call I was just talking to Mansi, and I know that she has a question about another very prominent person of Indian origin who I believe you're somewhat acquainted with.
Yes, thanks, Sanjeev. I felt like the conversation, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention your wife, Aisha, who, you guys have often been billed as kind of a power couple in Singapore, and she's very accomplished as the co-founder and CEO of an artificial intelligence solutions firm and incubator. And it just seems like artificial intelligence is becoming even more and more, part of everyone's, I feel like, conversations. Is there ever an opportunity for you guys to collaborate in terms of thought, in terms of initiatives, in the past and in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I love to tell certain stories about her and the impact she's had on my thinking, which is that, when we met and when we were dating in New York, she had, this was in around 2005, 2006. I saw a big giant book on her bookshelf, which was called The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. And as you know, the concept of the singularity and Ray Kurzweil as an inventor and intellectual is a really seminal figure in technology and innovation. And I had never heard of him. I had literally never heard of Ray Kurzweil. I had heard of, people like Samuel Huntington. And Aisha had been a student of his at Harvard when she was an undergraduate. So for me, I was just a foreign policy, political science nerd, and she was a technologist. And so we had very little in common in terms of professional, academic, intellectual overlap. And so everything I've learned about technology, in the last 10 years, 11 years that we've been married has been really, begins at that moment. And we did wind up writing a book together, Hybrid Reality. And we even started kind of sponsoring a lot of researchers together and so forth. And it really helped her develop her subsequent interests in smart cities, which she did her PhD in. And of course, thinking about artificial intelligence, which is now the field in which she has her own company. So, it's been, this is sort of, it's that marriage, like literally and figuratively, that came up with this term geotechnology that I still use a lot and other people have picked up on as well, in which we wrote about how it's the balance of innovation that drives the balance of power. And the balance of power is a very prominent concept in geopolitics, but most people focus on the military and less on technological innovation. And I think if it hadn't been for our conversations and collaboration, some of my most fundamental frameworks that I use in all of my writing, and very much in this book about Asia and the rise of Asia, they really come from that collaboration.
Wonderful. It's wonderful to hear.
Parag, one of the interesting things about you, one of the many interesting things about you, I should say, that people may not know, is that you are an avid mountain climber, having climbed several peaks above the 20,000-foot range. And I mentioned that specifically on this call because by happenstance, as it turns out, our founder, M.R. Rangaswamy, who's on the line with us, recently climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. So, M.R., do you have a question for Parag about that?
Sure, Parag. I just did this recently to bring awareness to deforestation around Kilimanjaro, and was an amazing journey. Obviously brutal, but awesome is what I term it.
Right.
So what gets you excited about climbing mountains? And give us at least one anecdote.
Oh, well, I did Kilimanjaro as well, and I went with a couple of friends. It was actually funny. It was the story about that was that it was a very last-minute decision. I was at Frankfurt Airport, and I was supposed to fly to Tripoli to meet Gaddafi and to also work on the chapter of my first book, The Second World, which was about Libya. But my visa had not come through as promised. So I'm standing there at Frankfurt Airport with a friend of mine who's German and had a visa. We said, oh, well, what do we do? We said, well, let's just take the next flight somewhere. I said, aha, Arusha. So we got on a Condor Airways charter flight and we flew to Arusha, and I had absolutely no gear whatsoever. So from the villagers, I borrowed and cobbled together kind of a jacket and boots and gloves, and up we went. And it was head spinning, and you know what I mean when I say that, of course, given the very thin air. That was a great, really great adventure. But I would say, and this is very relevant to us as members of the Indian diaspora, Mount Kailash is always going to be very special to me because I spent about 3 months driving across China, and particularly Tibet and Xinjiang, which are, of course, China's largest provinces and most depopulated. And, it's such a special, rugged scenery, the most incredible expanses, only comparable to the Western United States to some degree, but of course, much less known, much less developed. So driving westward from Lhasa, we got to Kailash, and it was, obviously it's a very special and holy and sacred site. And even to be permitted to do the yatra there, requires various permissions. So, to me, it was a special experience. And I was pretty much alone. It was just me and one Tibetan guide. And so I'll always remember being at Lake Manasaravar, doing that hike, and then continuing westward into the most remote parts of Tibet, which are still to this day some of the most unexplored places in the entire world. So it's not just the climb itself, as you well know, it's the whole journey and adventure around it.
Fantastic. No, that's awesome. Hopefully I'll be able to share more experiences with you in the future. But back to you, Sanjeev.
Well, one quick question I have for you, Parag, in the remaining minute that we've got. You were a geopolitical advisor, and this is back to more of a bit of a serious topic, but you were a geopolitical advisor to the U.S. Special Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. I believe it was in '07 or '08 or something around that time frame, when, of course, right, U.S. forces were so very active in that region. Just tell us, if you would, quickly, what it is that a geopolitical advisor to the armed forces does on the ground in these locations.
Well, that's actually a question I'm not supposed to answer, but
oh dear,
give you some.
I got you in trouble, huh?
No. I mean, I think the statute of limitations has probably expired on this. But there was a time when one could not really talk about even what one did or who one worked for. The unit that I was advising was not even publicly known, but it happens to be called Joint Special Operations Command, and you've all heard of it now because you've seen Zero Dark 30 about the killing of Osama bin Laden, and you've all heard of General Stanley McChrystal, who ran that unit, and he was portrayed by Brad Pitt in a movie recently. So I worked very, very closely with him, and he ran special operations and particularly elite units in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I worked with them, embedded with them, sort of shadowed them, if you will, on operations all over the region during really some of the peak of the surge and the violence in both countries. And because I had already written my first book, The Second World, in which I wrote about Syria, Iraq, and also Afghanistan, Pakistan, and had traveled already extensively in those countries without military, sort of escort. He had invited me to come and sort of, embed with them and help them kind of think strategically about their operations, given what I knew about the kind of policies between the countries, the cross-border relationships, and so forth. So it was, truly one of the, say, 3 or 4 most, intense, special, memorable, magical, just visceral experiences in my entire life. There's not a minute of it that I'll ever forget. And it's something that, probably no civilian has gotten to do in that way and probably won't get to anymore. And I also couldn't and perhaps wouldn't do it again when I think back at how dangerous those operations are. But also, of course, you come to admire the incredible degree of professionalism, that these elite American soldiers embody. So I hope that I was able to have, mildly positive impact on our thinking. The results obviously would indicate the contrary. Even generals at the highest level like him and David Petraeus, with whom I'm launching this book next week, we reported to General Petraeus every week during that time. They look back with obviously a fair bit of humility about how at the tactical level there were brilliant things being done, but at the strategic level, we of course did not really succeed in changing the national complexion and orientation the way we would have wanted. But an absolutely unforgettable experience. And I've written not about it directly because that's illegal, but I've certainly written the lessons from it in some of my books like Connectography, where I talk about the impact of foreign forces on these contexts and what are the more fundamental dynamics that really shape relations between Arab countries in a post-colonial context.
Well, Parag, or should I say Dr. Khanna, this has been a fascinating conversation. And we thank you so much for taking the time in the midst of your travels and various other meetings to talk to us. I'm sure that our listeners at Indiaspora will benefit greatly, not only from this webcast, but those that are so inclined to learn more about the global foreign policy space and the rise of Asia would do well to go run and purchase a copy of your book as well. So thanks a lot, Parag, for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.